workshop. It's entitled The Future of Civil Rights. This is the 11th year that we've had the Future of Civil Rights as a part of the conference. So we're glad to be back with all of you again. To start, I'd like to have my fellow panelists introduce themselves, tell us where you're from and where do you work? And we'll start with Whitney.
Thanks so much, Bob. Excited to be here and joined by all of you here on this, at least in Boston area, greater Boston area, this beautiful day, one of the first of the year. So I'd congratulate you all for being here thus far. My name is Whitney Demetrius. I'm the Director of Fair Housing Engagement here at CHAPA, which is the Citizens Housing and Planning Association. My role is really to ensure fair housing in all of our internal work at CHAPA, but also in partnership and in collaboration with others, and with the goal of really creating redress and policies and practices and programs that really work to ensure fair housing in all of its framework. So just really excited to be here. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you. Nadine?
Hi, everyone. And I also echo Whitney. Thank you all for being here on this beautiful day. My name is Nadine Cohen. I am the managing attorney of the Consumer Rights Unit at Greater Boston Legal Services. And I have a somewhat long history in the fair housing arena. Back in the late 1980s, I started a fair housing project at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, and we started doing fair housing testing. Then we later I was part of a group that founded the Fair Housing Center of Greater Boston and actually helped the people in Western Mass organize originally the Housing Discrimination Project, which became the Mass Fair Housing Center. So I've been involved in these issues for many years, and I'm so grateful to the organizers of this conference for keeping it going for so many years. Thrilled to be here.
Thank you, Nadine. And James?
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you for organizing this panel, Bob, and to your team members to keep this important annual conference going strong. I'm Professor Emeritus of Urban and Environmental Policy and Planning at Tufts University. I also assisted with research and writing of Boston's Affirmatively Assessing Fair Housing report. I originally started to work for the BHA on its AFH, but then the city asked me to help them out as well. Currently, I'm a member of the Community Advisory Committee Monitoring Committee appointed by Mayor Wu to ensure that the 14 goals of the assessment of fair housing are implemented and monitored and strengthened as much as possible. And a new project that I'm involved with, actually with CHAPA, is looking at trying to identify key and new voices in greater Boston cities to highlight and talk to them so we can highlight challenges and roadblocks towards effective fair housing. And at the same time, we also want to take a peek at what might be the public awareness about fair housing issues in places outside of Boston.
Thank you, James.
Thank you.
This is a great panel for me because I have known these folks for a very long time. I remember when I first started working at the Fair Housing Commission way back in 1988. That's where I met Nadine Cohen, right after the Skinner decision had just come out, and it was revolutionizing our work in fair housing in Boston. About 10 years ago, when I started working at the Fair Housing Center, I met Whitney And Whitney taught me everything that I know about testing, fair housing testing, because she's the fair housing testing guru. And James Jennings and I have known each other since the mid-'80s, going all the way back to the Black Agenda Convention, which his organization, the Trotter Institute, was largely responsible for organizing. So I've known these folks a long time, and it's a real treat to have them as a part of this panel. This year, instead of doing sort of the normal sort of panel formalities, we're going to make this just a real conversation between the four of us. And I'm just going to throw out a couple of questions just to get the conversation started. Tell us how you got involved in fair housing and civil rights work, and why do you continue to do this work many years later? James, why don't we start with you?
Can I just ask something beforehand? I know Corinne told people to turn their cameras off, but I find it really hard to talk to names and not faces. So if people want to turn their cameras on, I'd love to see people.
Okay.
Yeah.
I hope it just doesn't disrupt the audio, because in some of the other workshops, it interfered with the audio sometimes.
Well, let's try it.
We'll try it and see if it works. James? James, you're on mute.
Much early on, I was the senior evaluator for the demonstration disposition program, which at the time was HUD's largest housing rehabilitation program. And it was implemented over many years by Mass Housing. From that point, I also worked a little bit with the Empowerment Zone, which touched upon housing a little bit in fair housing. As I mentioned more recently, since 2016, 2017, I've been working with the Community Advisory Committee to put the assessment of fair housing report for Boston together. In my teaching, I would examine housing issues, economic development issues, race relations, and always kept bumping into, and I'll say something about this later, kept bumping into fair housing as very intersectoral. And so, and done a lot of other things, but I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Whitney?
Thanks, Bob. I often joke and say, I didn't choose fair housing chose me, because it has been something that certainly has drawn me in my academic work, but also personally in terms of my own housing story, my family's housing story, my ancestors' story. And where I started off as an temporary intern for a fair housing event that the Fair Housing Center of Greater Boston was doing. I started off from there and sort of worked my way throughout the organization, really with a passion for the work. I remember that first event we were holding, and Mel King at the end sort of ended us in a circle, this very formal event where everyone's in suit and tie and really talking about the fair housing issues. But he really ended us on a note and in a circle, holding hands and talking about the real work of fair housing and sort of challenging us to really make real the work that we were doing. And again, at that time, I was just coming in to help with the event, but really was inspired. And I imagine many of us in remembering him and his work are inspired by the legacy that he sort of put forward, where he was the board member of the Fair Housing Center of Greater Boston at that time. And so I am coming to this work really just knowing that I am kind of moving forward on the work that that others have done, but also knowing that part of my story has so much to do with fair housing and its impacts. And so really bringing my whole self in that way to the work. Where I, had interest in Black history and philosophy in school. That's what I sort of studied, but it's really sort of made practical in action what can be done to sort of redress some of the work. So that's some of what brings me to the space.
Thank you. Nadine.
Well, I think as a lawyer, I started getting involved in fair housing when I had clients who couldn't get certain housing because of their race. I remember a big case in Quincy, public housing, where they had totally segregated developments and an African-American woman wasn't able to obtain housing there. And I think that just got me into the whole fair housing arena. And what I learned and what I think is so powerful is there is a whole historical fair housing movement that began in the 60s, if not the late 50s. And Dr. King was a major leader of the fair housing struggle in Chicago in the 60s. He led open housing marches through the streets, and he often said it was the attack on the marchers were worse than what he experienced in the South, because housing is so personal. It is where you live. It is where you spend all your time. And being able to open up communities is a really important part of the civil rights movement. So I feel like I've always felt that fair housing and civil rights go together, and that many people don't understand either the history of the fair housing movement or the fact that it still exists day after day, even in cities like Boston, Springfield, Worcester, all over our state, and that we have to be very vigilant. I will also just add that as someone who was very tangentially involved in the Boston school desegregation lawsuit, which, as everyone knows, created so much racial tension in the city of Boston, and then has not really resulted in desegregated schools. I've always wondered, what if we had a housing desegregation lawsuit in addition to a school desegregation lawsuit, or instead of? Would those neighborhoods have been more diverse, and would the schools be more diverse? So I think this is a critical issue, and it's one we can say, oh, we did fair housing 10 years ago, 20 years ago. It's done with, because it's not. Thank you.
Thank you. And you're right, the work is not done. We have a long way to go. For myself personally, I got involved in fair housing in a very direct way in 1988 when I first went to work for the Boston Fair Housing Commission. And it was a very exciting time. The 1988 amendments had just come out. The Senate had just voted 93-7 to pass it, which was one of the last things to occur in the Reagan administration, of all administrations. But we got that passed, and it, as everyone knows, it added to new protected classes. That's where affirmatively furthering fair housing language first emerged, was in the 88 amendments, and a lot of beefing up of enforcement powers as well. And that's also around the time when, in the city of Boston, the Skinner decision was coming out, which basically ordered the city of, ordered HUD and the city of Boston to do something about the equitable distribution of CDBG funds, but it also pushed the city of Boston to form the commission. and an affirmative marketing program, which I ended up running at the commission. So that was sort of my entry to the work. And then about 10 years ago, when I went to work at the Fair Housing Center, I came back to fair housing work a second time, and it's stuck ever since. So I'm really glad to be in this work. And recently I became the executive director of the Boston Fair Housing Commission. So we're knee deep into the work. Another set of questions I'd like to pose to the group. Tell us 2 or 3 of the most important issues facing the fair housing and civil rights movement today, in your opinion. And also, what are some of the most dangers facing the movement as well? And James, I'll start with you.
Sure. You keep starting with me. I don't know what's going on here. I'm only kidding, of course. Well, let me make 2 observations, which I think touch upon the query that you raised. One observation, and this is a concern, is that outside of arenas like this one that we're in and having discussion, it seems to me that fair housing is still approached as only intentional discrimination. It's approached in a very, very siloed way. And again, that doesn't pertain to us here because we're having this conversation, but as I interact with public spaces, it comes up in various ways, what I think is a very siloed understanding of fair housing. One, the adverse impacts of unintentional discrimination are ignored or excused. And I don't want to put my colleagues on the spot, but this actually came up with some of our discussions as we were putting together the assessment of fair housing in Boston. There were people, city officials even, but not only city officials, who would say, well, yeah, this policy that we had in the past is impacting people of color negatively, but we can't do anything about that because that's not really fair housing and it's unintentional. And the other thing that is part of this concern I have, as I mentioned earlier, is that the intersectionality of fair housing is overlooked in many places. And let me give you some examples of this, of how fair housing, the intersectionality of fair housing is minimized when there's no justification, legal or otherwise, to minimize it. One example is where the place of fair housing is in local governance in some cities. As I start the project that I mentioned earlier, myself and my team have been looking at where fair housing is situated. And I won't mention any cities, but there are cities that approach fair housing as only the place where you bring in a discrimination complaint. Or fair housing now is part of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Or it's part of a office with one person, again, who may just be collecting instances of discrimination and referring them. So that really is more the situation than not, based on, again, this is very initial sense as I get involved with this study. But another way that the intersectionality of fair housing is overlooked or minimized, and again, this came up in our discussions around what is fair housing and what does it mean in the city of Boston, and that is defining affordable housing in ways which impact adversely low-income groups and communities of color. Affordable housing sounds good, but unless you use a fair housing lens to really dig into it, affordable housing might actually be hurting people of color in low-income communities. And again, that was, some of us made sure that that didn't happen and doesn't happen, but it's still an uphill struggle. And then the other instance where to me it seemed that fair housing was not really understood or siloed or actually minimized in terms of the enforcement of fair housing is the shifting narrative between fair housing and housing supply. you would not believe how many times when people raise fair housing issues, the response was, oh, well, we'll deal with that by increasing the housing supply. And it's related, but not necessarily so. Fair housing is fair housing, and increasing housing supply is important, but it's not a response to the full acknowledgement, requirements, implementation of comprehensive fair housing. And I guess the second observation I would make is that fair housing can actually be an effective tool against displacement and gentrification. And there are perhaps three ways that this can happen. And I have I published an article which I don't think has been put on chat yet. I couldn't figure out how to do it myself. But where I get into more specifics about this, but when we have in cities like Boston, real estate and proposed developments that might cause displacement, these proposals can be scrutinized with a fair housing lens, and that has not happened enough. And the best example we have in Boston is Suffolk Downs. When Suffolk Downs was first being proposed by developers, State Senator Lydia Edwards asked me to look at the 500-600-page proposal. There was not one word in there on fair housing. And to her credit, the state senator took it upon herself to lead a change in the city's zoning code to include strong fair housing language. Now, after you use a fair housing lens to look at this 600-page proposal, a lot of important things changes. So instead of building new and beautiful homes for one or two household families, one or two person households, I should say, we have to acknowledge that in the community that is adjacent and touches Suffolk Downs, you have families who need 2 or 3 bedrooms, not 1 or even 2 bedrooms. And so some of that has changed as a result of the fair housing lens, but it's still a struggle. Also, I think it's important, and this is where it's a stronger connection. There's a very strong connection between fair housing and civil rights, of course. But the other thing that fair housing sort of emphasizes, and again, this is a requirement, is strong community input and participation into programs and policies that local governments are going to be implemented. What happened in Boston as a result of taking this community input serious, and we talked to hundreds of people, we were all over the city gathering input, and the number one issue that emerged was the gentrification and the fear of displacement, which of course has a lot of ripple effects with schools and health and local economic development. And because fair housing has this, because community input and participation is a critical component, that allowed us to also look at the relationship or how fair housing can be used as a tool to respond to what people were saying in the community. You know, how are we not displaced? How can we stop gentrification? And that was a very effective tool. Let me stop there, and I'll come back to some of this perhaps.
Thank you, James. Same question for you, Whitney.
Thank you, Bob. I mean, again, I think I mentioned before, I'm a student of the three of you all. And so I'm not sure how much more I can really add to what James has mentioned, which is really so comprehensive, right? We have to be clear about what we mean when we're talking about fair housing, right? Fair housing as a civil rights, piece of legislation, but also fair housing as it means in its totality, right? And so I'll quote Lee Porter, who is the affectionately called the mother of fair housing. She is the executive director of the Fair Housing Council of Northern New Jersey, who recently was asked, what is fair housing? And she said that fair housing is fair living, right? Fair housing is fair living. Fair housing has so much to really do about not only where you choose to live, where you choose to move, where you choose to return to, right? Thinking about this idea of displacement, fair housing is so much more really than just housing. It has to do with access to jobs and education and transportation and access to amenities and your religious institution, your health, and healthy communities, environmental issues. Like it's so broad. And so I think to your question, there's a real opportunity, right, for us to reframe how we talk about fair housing. And to James' point about how it links to these other intersectional components, right? Where as you hear on the local level, oftentimes people are trying to disjoint zoning from fair housing, right? Although we know historically zoning has been used as a tool to perpetuate housing discrimination, right? And so it's by design. So part of what I think has to happen now is really in our work, in our rhetoric, in our outreach, it really has to be framed around seeing fair housing for what it is, right? Not just responding to a housing discrimination complaint, but also being able to broaden how we look at enforcement, to put resources behind education on the community level, on the housing provider level, being able to think more broadly around what does it mean to do systemic enforcement and testing and research around fair housing issues to really be able to inform policy and inform the practices and programs that are really impacting communities, and also to think about fair housing solutions in more than just this one lens, right? Thinking about what does it mean for communities that have been historically exclusionary, right? Versus communities who are facing issues of potential displacement, right? Who have been underserved and underfunded. And so thinking about what solutions look like on the local level that are sort of tailored, right? We talk a little bit about like, what does it mean with federal protections, as well as on the local level, but also state. And so at Chapel, we are working with some of our partners and some of our housing heroes in some ways, legislators who have really taken this on. You mentioned James, Senator Lydia Edwards. She has been pivotal in helping us frame a fair housing legislative policy that really is going to speak to what do we need to be doing right now, right? And I think as far as the solutions, what's important, it's a real danger if we just talk about the issues and if we're not putting resources behind it, is what I'll say, right? And so putting forward, and I'll share in the chat some information about the State Office of Fair Housing, right? This piece of legislation that we're working with at CHAPA alongside Senator Lydia Edwards, Rep. China Tyler, and Rep. Dave Rogers, to really be able to fund the work that's necessary across the state to ensure fair housing, right? And also to create it in a way where it's malleable, right? It can be tailored, it can be research, it could be special projects, it could be education outreach campaigns, but also the other portion. So specifically, that State Office of Fair Housing is going to be partnered with the Fair Housing Trust Fund. We have to put money, right? We have to be thinking about budgets as moral documents. How do we say that these things are important, but also fund them so that they can be resourced, they can be actualized as well. And so the other point about that in terms of the intersectionality, right? This particular office could work with the other state executive offices and agencies as well. It has to be a coordinated effort. We cannot be talking about housing and fair housing in silos. It has to be in conjunction. I'll pause there.
Thank you, Whitney. Nadine, same question. 2 or 3 major issues facing fair housing and civil rights.
Well, I think Whitney and James very eloquently covered so much of it. And I'll just emphasize some of the things that they said. I think affirmatively furthering fair housing is a really critical part of the fair housing movement. Bob, I think you mentioned it was in the 1988 amendments to the Fair Housing Act, but I think actually it was in the 1968 Fair Housing Act itself,
Okay,
which said that you had to do more than just combat discrimination. You had to take affirmative steps. And so what affirmatively furthering fair housing means, it means that local governments take meaningful actions in addition to directly combating housing discrimination that overcome longstanding patterns of housing segregation and foster inclusive communities that are free from the barriers that prevent access. And I think the other part, it means that fair housing has to be a part of all city and state and federal agencies. It can't be just the responsibility of a fair housing committee or a commission. And what is pretty amazing is that this concept was put in the 1968 law. And did it have any teeth? Absolutely not. For many, many years, some of us were saying states and local governments have an obligation to affirmatively further fair housing. No one knew what that really meant or how to do it. Then in 2015, after many, many years of advocates pushing, the Obama administration came out with an affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, and many local activists got together and got their cities and localities to work on fair housing assessments and really try to put into action this very lofty concept of affirmatively furthering fair housing. So what happened after all these years of hard work? Trump came along and rescinded the fair housing rule. And just recently, the Biden administration came out with a very expansive and I think very good rule, which has room for improvement. And I think some of the points that people are making are very critical, which is that it has to, fair housing cannot be equated with affordable housing. There have to be direct efforts to really focus on the equity issues in housing, building housing, having public housing. None of that is going to really totally address the fair housing issues. I want to note that the National Housing Law Project recently put together comments that are due to HUD. I don't know, is it this week or next week, very soon?
we've been granted an extension.
What's that?
We've been granted an extension until April 24th.
All right,
Yes.
that's great. While affirmatively furthering fair housing requires community engagement throughout the fair housing process, there have to be more than just, I think the rule says 3 meetings. You need ongoing community input to really understand what the needs of the communities are. And sometimes, you have to frame the issues for people and just listen to them, because no one's going to say, my way of affirmatively furthering fair housing is this. They're going to say, I tried to get this apartment and I, was told it was available and I showed up and it wasn't. And, there are so many different issues there. I think that one of the things the National Housing Law Project comments on, that there should be data that talks about terminations of federal housing assistance, evictions, and displacements, and not just final evictions in a court process, but understanding the whole housing continuum and what is happening to people, and make data available about where housing voucher recipients are able to lease up housing. We all know that that's a major issue. So you get a voucher, but then you're out in the community and half the places won't rent to you, even though in Massachusetts, we have a direct law that says you can't discriminate against someone with a rental subsidy. And I think HUD in the regulation has to be clearer that any of the strategies that are incorporated in the fair housing plans which are now called equity plans, are going to avoid displacement and benefit existing residents and preserve the cultural characteristics of neighborhoods and community. So there is a lot to the rule. I think there's also a need to focus on immigrant communities, survivors of sexual assault. And one of the things that I think the comments from this national group talked about, we also have to focus on people returning from prisons to the community and be able to ensure that they have opportunities for housing. And it is something that should really be as broad and inclusive as possible. I just want to add that there is a complaint process to ensure that program participants are meeting their affirmatively furthering fair housing obligations. And I think people feel that that process needs to be a little clarified and expanded. So one of my big issues is facing fair housing is affirmatively furthering. However, and this goes to both what James and Whitney said, when Bob also asks, what are the most important dangers? And I have to say that in the face of the attack of the right, we cannot be off in our own little silos and say, we are fair housing advocates. We are criminal justice advocates. We are, union activists. We are domestic violence advocates or against domestic violence. I think that the refusal of the growing right to teach the true history of our country, the history of slavery, the history of the civil rights movement, including the fair housing movement, and the banning of books that provide a diverse view of our country is really the beginning of the end of a just and free and democratic society. And we can't just put blinders on and say, I'm a fair housing advocate, if we're not out in the street fighting against the suppression of the truth and the history of our country. We're going to be in bad shape. So I just really echo what James and Whitney said. We can't be in silos. We have to work together, and that's where the intersectionality comes in, and we can't have other people define who we are or what our rights are. So that's my soapbox for the day. James wants
James, you got a comment?
Yes, and it's really just a follow-up. So Nadine, Whitney, you put some important information. You did as well, Nadine. And Nadine, you mentioned that it was the 1968 Fair Housing Act, which provided this framework of intersectionality. Fair housing has to be approached broadly. But we know that at a lot of local levels, state governments and city governments, they resisted that and they challenged that legally. They went to the courts to say, no, fair housing is only fair housing. It's not all these things these people are talking about, or what's even in the 1968 law. I just want to remind us that the Supreme Court so far has been the arbiter and has come down hard on insisting that fair housing, it has to be intersectional and do all the things that Whitney and Nadine talked about. The Shannon decision in 1970, Trafficante 1972, Otero decision in 1973, the NAACP Boston branch 1988. Some of you mentioned the Skinner decision. There was also a Huntington decision, the Texas Inclusive Communities Act. People tried to attack fair housing from all these little corners, and the Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court, has consistently looked at the law and said, no, what's on the books justifies intersectionality. It justifies breaking the silos that you mentioned, Nadine, to move forward, because fair housing really is a civil rights issue.
Bob, I just have to add one thing. Thank you, James. I think that's very important, but I forgot to mention one thing that just came to my attention a couple of hours before this panel and really hurts my heart very much. In the anti-abortion pill decision that I think the Fifth Circuit just came out with, they found that the group that were suing the FDA had associational standing based on the Havens Realty decision, which is the major fair housing decision that says fair housing organizations have the standing to bring fair housing complaints because they had a diversion of resources and a frustration of mission. And here in this horrible decision, they're saying plaintiff associations have also suffered independent agent injuries because FDA's actions have frustrated their organizational effort to educate their members and the public on the effects of mifepristone. See Havens Realty Corp v. Coleman. And then they say that they've expended time, energy, and resources. This is really perverse to take a major fair housing case and use it in this context. So I don't know what it means. Maybe it means the Supreme Court's gonna uphold Havens. I don't know, but you know, James, you mentioned a lot of the Supreme Court cases. We just don't know what's gonna happen to this whole body of law that has been built up over the last 50 years. And, but this, I just had to put out the Havens issue because it's very distressing. Sorry.
Yeah, that is very distressing. But there's been a theme and a little bit of a momentum at our conference over the last 3 days, and it's popped up in several of our workshops, where people are suggesting, and this might be a way of pushing back against decisions like this. People have been talking about, you know, the Fair Housing Act has not been amended since 1988. The act itself, the piece of legislation, has not been amended since 1988. And that document, that law, is a 20th century law. It is an attempt by fair housing advocates to assess fair housing, but in the context of the late 20th century, perhaps what we need to think about is amending the Fair Housing Act again. Now, I realize this is a tough political climate to do this in, but I think we don't want to go into the legislation. We want to do what they did in 1988, to pass another law to basically correct some of the flaws in the 68 Act. But we do need a more modern, up-to-date version of the Fair Housing Act. And a lot of folks in the conference have been talking about what it would take to make that happen. We need additional protected classes. We need to address the very issues you've just raised around gentrification and displacement. All the time we hear, and we hear it in Boston quite often, that an attempt to provide housing and earmark it for people in our communities who are threatened with displacement is somehow a violation of the Fair Housing Act. We run into that all the time. And I think it's about time that either through legislation or regulation, or maybe our affirmatively furthering fair housing document, which you just cited, could begin to address that. That people who are struggling to stay in a neighborhood that they have been born and raised in, and their attempt to do that, and if we supply housing to those folks, that is not a violation of the Fair Housing Act. That's got nothing to do with fighting segregation and bigotry and prejudice. Folks are simply trying to stay in their neighborhood where they currently are, and they're under threat of being pushed out. And I think a lot of folks in Boston are now talking about, in the context of affirmative marketing, that when we have units that are coming on the market and they're available, perhaps we should do some special marketing to people who have been displaced from Boston and who would like to return. I don't see that as problematic for the Fair Housing Act. As a matter of fact, I think it's a remedy for a much bigger problem. Because if we allow gentrification displacement to continue apace, we're going to end up with a region that's resegregated, but it's going to look very different geographically, where people are placed and where people end up geographically, where their housing is located. So if we don't take these steps, I think we're going to find ourselves in an even bigger problem. So do people think this is time to modernize the Fair Housing Act? And maybe the assessment of fair housing is one of the key vehicles to do that. James?
I think you make some important points. I kind of agree with Nadine. I'm not sure what the politics are in something like that, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try it, and push for it. But what you're saying, Bob, is also in the 1968 Fair Housing Act and its legislative history or its administrative history. In 1995, HUD produced something called the Fair Housing Planning Guide. And in that planning guide, 1995, it states exactly what you said. Fair housing should not be done in a way that actually inadvertently discriminates against people, protected classes who want to stay in their own communities. It is that we have to challenge segregation. But again, when we look at Boston, there are a lot of places in Boston that is still segregated, very segregated. That also has to have some fair housing attention to it to a certain extent. It's not just, you have to leave this community and we're not going to make any investments because that would violate fair housing. That's just a twisted logic around fair housing. And again, HUD has always been clear, and some of the decisions that I mentioned always been clear that fair housing has to reflect a balanced approach. So the people that you're referring to, Bob, are not in effect subsidizing fair housing for other groups of people.
Bob, if I could jump in, some really, really important points. And I think there needs to be more conversations about this space in terms of what things we should be considering in this moment that we find ourselves in, right? In terms of what change is necessary, what modifications, what adjustments. Again, fair housing is so much about choice, right? Where you choose to live, and where you choose to live, it should be a choice that you're able to make free from housing discrimination, right? So much of it is built into that. I'm certainly at CHAPA. Our goal is to ensure that choice is accessible, that it's affordable, that it's safe, that it's healthy. But really, how do we also think about solutions to some of this in terms of thinking about different types of communities? Again, communities that have been historically exclusionary, communities that are facing displacement, and thinking about fair housing as it relates to where you decide to live, where you want to move, where you want to stay, remain, and where you want to move back to, right? And so doing this sort of assessment around, communities and individuals who have been displaced, I think is important. And I think it's been baked into the framework, of what fair housing has really always been about in terms of affirmatively furthering fair housing and taking, proactive steps to make sure that all communities are thriving, right? And sometimes we talk about opportunity areas, but really it's about every community should be an area of opportunity, right? It should be you should have opportunity to thrive, every community, right? And so if we are investing in all communities, people have access to choice, right? And so I think it really makes a lot of sense to think about what are those proactive steps that we have to take, those policies, those practices, those sort of creative ideas to think to enhance that, right? And what doesn't often come up in these conversations is about how much of those communities are welcoming, are really are open, and what are folks' experiences when they are in communities, right? And what does it mean for someone to move out, to be displaced, and we start talking about trauma and harm and acts of violence as a form of housing discrimination. We really have to be clear when we talk about these things in communities and thinking about, well, why would somebody want to move back into a community? We have it's so nuanced, right? It's really about choice, but also about how do we build into every community to be a community that thrives, but also that's welcoming, that's open, and as James mentioned, really there's a balanced approach, right? I think this is why those sort of planning guides you alluded to, James, the reports, the research that is done, the qualified renters need not apply, right? That looked at bias in the rental market for individuals who have a Section 8 voucher and who are Black, right? And the different treatment that they received. And it's like, okay, we see that as a result of this report in Greater Boston, but what does that mean for us? What is it that we really need to be doing? Because it's so much more that gets played out when you start talking about people who are displaced or steered out of communities, right? So again, I think that there are a lot of lessons learned, right, that we'll find in this space, and we have to be creative. We have to be willing to be creative about what the solutions are.
And one of the reasons I raised this, one of the reasons I feel very passionately about this issue of displacement, having been a person that was displaced from my neighborhood by public policy during the urban renewal days back in the 60s and 70s. And I saw the impact of public policy and how it literally urban renewal dismantled the Black community in the South End portion of Boston. And a huge portion of Roxbury as well got displaced because of urban renewal. So I know from personal experience the impact that public, and somebody said in the chat, urban removal, that was one of the nicknames we had for it. But when you look at all the analysis that's been done privately, in the academic world, governmental, all the studies that have been done, the folks that get displaced and the folks under threat of displacement are protected class members. So I see this as a major fair, even a bigger fair housing issue that's on the table than the one that other people have proposed, that somehow this is discriminatory in some way. I said, you're going to have an even bigger fair housing problem on your hands if someone comes up with a class action suit, a fair housing class action suit on behalf of all of these folks that are under the threat of displacement. And when you do the studies, you can see exactly who the folks are. You know who they are demographically, you know where they're geographically located, you can see the market forces that are hitting their communities, and you know it's only a matter of time before they're pushed out. So I think it's a difficult issue, but I think it's one that we have to take seriously. And I'm hoping that in this new HUD reg, that HUD takes this up seriously and addresses it in a really clear manner.
I agree, Bob, and I think that's why it's so important to have individuals, members of the community who are directly impacted as part of the solutions. This is why community engagement is so important, right? And I think to your point around the AFFH proposed rule, of course, there's some community engagement built into the requirement for the equity plans. Mm-hmm. However, what would, as Nadine mentioned, there's advocates are saying it's good, but there's opportunity for it to be built out a little bit better. And I think naming ways to engage, naming who stakeholders are. I think we oftentimes think of stakeholders and then we're not always talking about the same thing, right? And making sure that individuals who are directly impacted are part of the solutions, right? The individuals who have been displaced are in the conversation around what the solutions might be, and the obligation for grantees, for jurisdictions to then affirmatively further fair housing, to proactively think about what those solutions look like for their community. This is why it's so important to have residents as part of those conversations. And to the question in the chat, really where it talks about people being able to speak out on fair housing issues and not have fear of retaliation, that has to be baked into this as well, right? And so again, where the equity plans give some room for community engagement, you have to also think about what the barriers are for people to participate. Don't just put a notice up on your website and think that people are going to come. We have to go to people so that we can hear their voices. You have to think about when the meeting is. Is the meeting hybrid? Is it virtual and in person? Is there food? Is there childcare? Is there elder care? Is there translation services? In interpretation, both virtually and in person. Do you have ear headsets for people? Like, we have to be planning ahead to make sure that we get it right. And I think that that's a space where the AFFH rule in its final version could really build out a little bit better to make sure that communities know what we mean when we say we want you to do community engagement. And I think the example of the City of Boston's Community Advisory Committee that you all were part of was a great example for being able to get that done well, to really hear from voices that really informed that AFFH zoning ordinance, right? And help get it right, because you were really hearing from people who are directly impacted on the community level.
And I want to address one reaction I saw in the chat. The Fair Housing Act is really all about freedom of choice, that people have the right to choose where they want to live. But I don't think it's organized segregation to suggest that when people in any community struggle to stay in that community, that they're suffering from some sort of self-segregation. I don't think those two instances are equivalent. I think that's a matter of choice, where people want to live. And if they choose to live in a community where the majority of the people are, from their group, okay. But where the civil rights issue arises is when other people want to move to that community. Do they have a right to do so? And the Fair Housing Act says they most certainly do. One of the impacts of gentrification in my neighborhood is that the racial composition of Roxbury has changed dramatically in the past 10 or 15 years. And I have seen no organized presence to suggest that people can't. And there have certainly been no political or other moves to keep people out. So just because people want some kind, I think somebody just mentioned the term cultural continuity, that does not always suggest a racist attitude or a segregation type of attitude, or an attitude based on segregation. These are some of the fine distinctions that I think those of us in the civil rights movement have to be very, very mindful of. There are folks in my neighborhood who have been here 3 or 4, maybe 5 generations, and they're terrified at the prospect of being pushed out of their community by either market forces or public policy. And I don't think it's against the spirit of the Fair Housing Act to suggest to those folks that they're taking a pro-segregation or a self-segregation attitude simply because they want to stay in the neighborhood. And I would also raise in the African-American community, because of redlining, because of disinvestment, a lot of those policies shaped those communities, but despite all of that, people in the African-American community pushed back. They organized, they started businesses, they raised families, they did a lot of sweat equity to improve those communities over the decades. And some of them would like to stay in that community and reap some of the benefits of some of the work that they've done. And I don't think that's an unreasonable position for people to take, as long as they're respectful of other folks who would also like to move into the community.
Before we move on, I know I think we want to hear from people in the audience because there's a lot of knowledge out there, but I just wanted to address briefly a comment in the chat about needing accountability, enforcement, congressional funds, and access to legal service, legal assistance must be available to those in distress and fearing retaliation. I think that's a good point. While we have federal and state enforcement agencies, we really have to hold their feet to the fire and ensure that they do the right thing and really are aggressive with their enforcement actions. So I think that's one thing. It would be great for there to be some funding for legal assistance for victims of discrimination. That's a big issue when people file discrimination complaints at either HUD or the MCAD. The landlords, the developers, the banks all have representation and the individuals don't. So that's something that maybe CHAPA's Office of Fair Housing on the state level could really help with. But the last thing I want to say is the law right now is supposed to protect people from retaliation. I have always told my clients that that's what the law says. I can't guarantee you're not going to be retaliated against in some way, but I really feel strongly that if that is happening, you have to go back to the enforcement agencies, you have to go to the press, you have to go to community organizations. And I was the other day at Al's funeral, and very inspiring and uplifting. And, you know, people pointed out so much that power concedes nothing without demand. And we really have to demand that the law be followed, even if it's not as strong as we'd like. But and it's what Whitney said, it has to come from the community. So I just hope if anyone is being retaliated against for making a fair housing complaint, that they reach out to some of the people in this group.
And if you're in the city of Boston and that happens to you, please come and visit me at the Boston Fair Housing Commission. We would love to take that case. We have about 25 minutes left. If you have a question or a comment, please put it in the chat. I'm going to read one of the comments that have come in. Yes, the opportunity agenda, I think, tends to denigrate low-income communities, and also posits that the way to succeed is to live in suburbia, be near people with money, and that is problematic. What do people think of that comment in the chat?
Yes.
Most certainly agree. I think it's problematic to talk about communities, or we're going to talk about opportunity agenda, opportunity areas versus non-opportunity areas. I think that's what you have to be clear about when we talk about it in that way. We're also calling other communities non-opportunity communities, and really the goal is to make sure that all communities can thrive, people can make choice where they want to live, that all communities are open and welcoming, right, as well. And so I would agree that it's certainly problematic to be using those terms. While I understand some of the what drives that, right, specifically from sort of a policy and research agendas around that, sort of trying to create some change around that. However, it's problematic, and I definitely want to turn it over to James, because I know you have particular insights on this very issue.
Well, let me just, two thoughts. One, we have to keep our eyes on the prize, and the eyes on the prize is housing choice, real housing choice for everyone. We have to make sure that narratives, as well-meaning as they are, move us away from keeping our eyes on the prize. And so again, decent, affordable housing, ensuring that decisions, directly and indirectly, do not impact negative.
I think we may have
Oh,
James may
James,
have
you
froze.
froze.
Yeah, you froze, James.
But I understand his point about, that it doesn't impact negatively, right, on communities, and we have to be mindful of the language too that we're using in these spaces when we're talking about fair housing, when we're talking about civil rights, what that really means, what we mean when we say that, and being very clear, because I think it has some potential negative implications for communities.
And I also think some of, like you just said, some of the terminology that we use needs to be changed. It needs to be updated. For example, when you say segregation, I think of not only private action, but governmental action, as opposed to people making individual or even collective choices about where they need to live. I think the situation has gotten a lot more complicated in the 21st century, and we need some new language and some new terminology to describe what we're up against.
That's right. That's right. I think we should be ever evolving, right, and making sure that we're getting it right. And also, like you said, to also be mindful of the history of some of these terms and how it is received differently based off of your history and knowledge of the term and how it's been used and how it can be used and the implications there. I see another comment in the chat, so I'll pause. Bob, I know you might want to uplift that.
I see another comment. It says, well, gentrification and income inequality are the engines driving the destruction of communities. And the elected officials and those in power are mostly silent.
I want to lift up what James had mentioned earlier, just in terms of on the local level, right? What are local cities and towns doing in terms of fair housing? Are they putting fair housing at the forefront of their work, right? How do we hold elected officials accountable to their fair housing plans? And as an obligation to have a committee that not only is responding to fair housing cases and sort of referring them to other agencies, but are doing some proactive work around education and outreach campaigns, doing real work around what it means for their community to be welcoming, right? To have cultural competency and cultural events in their community that they hold that allow for people to feel welcome in communities. And I think there's something to this idea of on the community level for us to hold our legislators and hold our individuals accountable on the local level to ensure that that's happening on the state level as well, on the federal level as well, but really just thinking about this idea of community engagement and where we can make and affect some change.
Nadine, this issue, thank you, Whitney. Nadine, this issue of language and terminology, I mean, as an attorney, you deal with that language and that terminology every day, every time you handle a case. Do you think that the language and terminology that we use in the fair housing work that we do needs to be changed or improved upon?
Well, it's so interesting that you say that, Bob, because I think, and I could be remembering this incorrectly, but I think many, many years ago, when people talked about the opportunity agenda or low opportunity areas versus high opportunity areas, it was from a very progressive point of view. I think John Powell actually was one of the people who talked about the opportunity index. But things get distorted and misused by some people, and it made it seem as if only living in a high opportunity area is where you put your efforts, whereas Bob, what you said, communities like Roxbury, long-term African-American stable communities were disinvested from, and people shouldn't have to move from those communities. They need the opportunities and investment in those communities. So I think the language gets distorted. It sometimes doesn't start out being bad, but it really loses what its original meaning was. And yes, in the law, it's sometimes, you have to frame things like in the language of the Supreme Court, and, who are they to really be the arbiters of, how we want to view communities or opportunities. So I think that gets tricky, but I think we all have to be conscious of our language and terminology, and it changes. And I think we have to be open to that. What at one point seemed like a good way to describe something may not be, again, a good way. And I can remember this discussion at a fair housing conference at Harvard about, I don't know, 20, 25 years ago, where there was this tension between people saying, it might have been around the HUD moving to opportunities program, where low-income people of color were encouraged to move to, white suburban communities. And I remember at that very meeting, Mel King standing up and saying, wait a minute, why should we have to move? Why can't we have the same benefit in our communities? And I just want to say that investment, and I don't want to let the banks and the financial industry off the hook here, because a lot of how these quote opportunity, non-opportunity areas got set up was through the disinvestment of the banks and redlining and the targeting by subprime lenders of low-income communities of color to give people lots of loans they could never, ever afford, that were predatory, that had really, awful features in them. And then people lost their homes, destabilized neighborhoods. So why can't we force those financial institutions to make those investments in our communities? And I just want to add, there is something called the Community Reinvestment Act. And we in Massachusetts used to have a CRA coalition many, many years ago. But that is a powerful law that requires banks and financial institutions to invest in the communities where they do business. Right. We have to really come together and force them to do that. So I really think that's another organizing strategy. I'm not sure I answered your question, but.
Well, you'll be glad to know, Nadine, I made a similar proposal to the Boston City Council about 3 weeks ago.
All right.
We were talking about the link deposit law, the link deposit ordinance that we have on the books in Boston. And I suggested that those banks that are city depositories, in which the city of Boston places their money, that there should be a provision that for X amount of deposits that they take out of our community, there should be a certain percentage of loans made back to our community. If we can take a risk in putting our money into their banks, they can take a risk lending to us.
I think that's brilliant. Great.
And so the city council might be taking that up and trying to apply that to city depositories.
Yeah, just on the banking area, I want to say Boston did many years ago when Felix Arroyo Jr. was there on the city council. We helped pass a banking ordinance that said Boston will not keep money in banks that do certain things like foreclose on people, evict people, all of that. And you know what? Spent a lot of energy getting it passed. It never got really implemented. So laws are great, but then you have to make sure that they get enforced and implemented correctly.
Another comment from the chat. The whole opportunity agenda is about moving people to white neighborhoods and just writing off communities of color. Still a focus of a lot of work. It's those white suburbs that are segregated. Comments?
Well, I guess the only comment I want to sort of add to the conversation, building off what we were saying, is we know that a lot of this is by design, right? Start talking about why are there low opportunity areas, right? A lot of that is a result of disinvestment and by design. And so we have to be as intentional to design a framework and policies that's going to redress some of this.
And if we followed Nadine's outline for investing in all communities in an equitable fashion, over time, if everybody had adequate amounts of opportunity in all our communities, over time, you wouldn't have the kinds of racial and ethnic enclaves that we have now. People are in those enclaves because they feel safe there. And safety is a major concern, whether it's dealing with the police or whether it's economic stability. People feel safe there. But once they see that opportunity is widespread, no matter where they live, then you're going to start seeing the kind of diverse and integrated neighborhoods that everybody has dreamed about. But it's not going to happen until we address the imbalance between the opportunities and the resources that are put into different neighborhoods compared to ours.
This just made me think of one other thing, this question, and that is the MBTA Communities Law.
Yes.
Which is great in terms of building more dense housing near transit hubs. But what does it not say? Who is that housing for and who is going to live in that housing? So again, there has to be a fair housing component to the MBTA law, and it has to be up to the cities and towns, I think, to really ensure that. And Bob, that's where you get into your affirmative marketing and how you market that housing and who it goes to. So just made me think of that I've always been concerned about.
Here's a question that someone posed. Do we think changing ethnic language landscape in these communities changes the conversation? I guess their notion was if we change the language and the terminology that we're using to.
That's a professorial question, James.
Okay. And I'm sorry, I guess there was a blackout in Cambridge for a moment. And so I disappeared, right?
Yeah,
Right.
you were off for a few minutes.
Sorry. No, so if I understand the question correctly, I think what it triggers in my mind, again, keeping our eyes on the prize, challenging segregation wherever it is. And so if we talk about opportunity neighborhoods without challenging this segregation in these very same places, I think that's not the way to go. And challenging segregation means that you're going to see more diversity in these communities, linguistic and otherwise, certainly racial, certainly economic. And so the real fight for us is not just to make, let's say, in our own city, an ideal fair housing situation, but wherever we live and whatever we're connected with. And just to talk about Boston, we're part of the greater Boston area. So when we see policies, as you mentioned, Nadine, and good initiatives that do not use a fair housing lens, it's going to create problems and perpetuate segregation and divisions. We have to first challenge segregation and then say, okay, what's next? But at least in Massachusetts, there's a lot of segregation, and there's segregation in Boston. A lot of times we have these conversations and we forget that we have census tracts in Boston that for a long time have been 85, 90% white, not Latinx, while communities of color have been growing and concentrated in some places within Boston. So I don't know if I answered the question correctly, but that's how I heard the question.
And here is another comment. It says, economic boycotting that can begin individually is one avenue. As Bob Dylan apparently said, money swears. For those of us who know or remember who Bob Dylan was. Comments. Where we spend our money is very important. We talk about organizing as community members, we talk about organizing as labor activists, etc. But organizing your consumption and where you spend your money and where you invest your money can also be a very powerful tool for change. And I think it's something that progressives really need to think more about, because I don't think we make very good use of our consumer spending as an entity that we can use to bring about change.
And we do have, an example was mentioned, the ordinance that the dean mentioned, the responsible banking ordinance was actually vetoed by Mayor Menino, but then it passed. The city council overrode his veto, led by Felix Arroyo Jr. But we haven't had a mechanism to really take that and begin enforcing it. And perhaps the action that you took, Bob, a few weeks ago in making a presentation to the city council, that might light some fire, but we do have some tools that if we were to use more aggressively in a positive way, might move the needle. And certainly this is an example of an economic boycott. Banks, if you don't play ball with what we think is important in Boston, we're not going to play ball with you. We'll play ball with somebody else.
Right.
And I'd add to that this idea about where we bank matters in some ways, right? Nadine, you mentioned the CRA, Community Reinvestment Act, and the fact that, as I understand it, they're under, they had an open comment period where they're doing some amendments. And as part of what folks are hoping, advocates are hoping to be in the final version, which we should be hearing about sometime this year, would be to really include an added provision that banks not only that have brick and mortar sites in communities, but also that have sort of ATMs. If they have any sort of system in communities, that they then will be obligated. And I think that will expand the amount of investment that banks would then be obligated to put back into communities, right? And so we're paying close attention to see what's going to happen in the final version, but really that expansion I think is significant, because I think many folks have talked about some of the limitations of the CRA and what that means particularly in communities of color, where there aren't brick and mortar banks, but there may be a Bank of America ATM, for instance, right? And that those obligations don't necessarily carry over. So just interested to see, we should be paying close attention to the amendments that many advocates have submitted comments around, and interested to see what those impacts would be. You're right, money swears, money moves things, for sure.
Thank you, Whitney. And thank you to everybody in the audience who tuned in. Thank you to my three incredible panelists who I've learned so much from over the years. I won't say how many years, but this has been an excellent panel. I look forward to it every year. And we are right up to time. And here is John Fisher.
Yeah, Big Brother is watching you.
Close us out.
Yes. I just, as a matter of fact, I was just typing a reminder that we were running out of time here. And quite literally, I could make that into kind of a metaphor for where we are today, unfortunately, when we talk about the future of civil rights and fair housing and so forth. But we are unfortunately out of time for this particular session. I really want to thank the panel. This is always one of my favorite parts. I always try to at least get to the last part of you guys. If I never can quite make it to all of it. And to everybody who's been here today, I just want to thank you for attending the 2023 Fair Housing and Civil Rights Conference. Next year, we will have the 2024 Fair Housing and Civil Rights Conference, and knock on wood, this one will be both in person and televised, as they say, so that for those of you around the country who can't make it to this area, we will still have it available to you. And any workshops which we were allowed to record, including this one, should be available up on our website in approximately 2 weeks or so. Essentially enough time for us to kind of catch our breath, have a good stiff drink, relax a little bit, take the weekend, and then put things back together. But in any event, in about 2 weeks, we should have them up on the website in the resources section. And again, also as things come along that may need special attention, we may have a few special workshops between now and next year. But again, thanks everyone for attending. And thank you again, Bob, as always, for being part of the group that makes this happen, that makes this possible. And again, thanks to all of you on the panel and everyone who's been here.
It was a great
Have a good day.
conference, and we look forward to next year.
Even better.
Even better.
All right.
Thank you
Take
all.
care, everybody.
Take care,
Thank
everyone.
you.